The air in Judge Caprio's courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island, was usually a hum of respectful anticipation, a quiet understanding of the legal process unfolding. Today, however, that familiar calm shattered. J.D. Vance, a figure whose annoyance was palpable even from a distance, stood before the judge. Judge Caprio, a man known for his measured tones and grandfatherly wisdom, was in the midst of explaining a standard court procedure, his voice a steady guiding presence. But Vance, with a dismissive wave of his hand and a sudden loud interruption, cut him off mid-sentence. "Honestly, Judge," Vance scoffed, his voice echoing with an unwarranted disdain, "this is just a waste of time. Can't we just get this over with?" His words hung heavy in the silence that followed. Vance, seemingly oblivious to the palpable shift in the room's atmosphere, crossed his arms over his chest, a gesture of defiance that seemed to scream his disregard for the proceedings. He rolled his eyes, a childish act of rebellion that was entirely out of place in such a setting. A low mutter escaped his lips, something about wasting his time. A sentiment he clearly believed was universally understood and agreed upon. It was painfully clear that J.D. Vance believed himself to be above the rules, above the meticulous process of the court, and most certainly above the authority of Judge Caprio. He offered no apology, no sign of contrition, only a blatant refusal to acknowledge the judge's rightful position. Observing this unfolding drama, I braced myself for the customary judicial reprimand, perhaps a sharp word or a stern warning. But Judge Caprio, to my surprise and the quiet astonishment of everyone present, did not erupt in anger. Instead, he paused, a beat of silence stretching into an eternity. He looked directly at Vance, his gaze unwavering, penetrating, and then a very slight, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of amusement, but one that hinted at a deeper understanding, a quiet resolve forming beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. It was the kind of smile that made you wonder what profound thought was brewing behind those wise eyes. The judge's voice, when it came, was still calm, but it carried an undeniable weight, a steel hidden beneath velvet. "Mr. Vance," Judge Caprio stated, his eyes still fixed on the defiant man, "we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The choice is yours." The air in the courtroom, already thick with tension, seemed to solidify, becoming almost suffocating. A collective intake of breath could be heard, a silent acknowledgement that the stakes had just been raised significantly. Some people just don't learn until they learn the hard way. This phrase, a timeless adage, resonated in my mind as I watched the scene. It seemed Judge Caprio was about to deliver a lesson that Vance desperately needed, whether he knew it or not. The judge then gestured subtly to a court officer, a burly figure who had been standing stoically by the side. The officer, without a word, stepped forward, his movements deliberate and purposeful. A shiver ran down my spine. A wave of uncertainty washed over me, and I, along with everyone else in that courtroom, wondered what Judge Caprio was planning. What kind of hard way did he have in mind for J.D. Vance? Before we continue with the unfolding drama, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your engagement helps us bring you more stories like this. Providence, Rhode Island, is more than just a city. It's a tapestry woven with generations of stories, traditions, and an unspoken code of conduct. It's a place where the scent of rich coffee mingles with the salty air off Narragansett Bay, where the bustling energy of Federal Hill, with its vibrant Italian-American heritage, gives way to the quieter, tree-lined streets of historic neighborhoods. Portuguese immigrants have built thriving communities here, and a growing diversity of cultures adds new layers to its character. In Providence, there's a deep-seated respect for community, for elders, and for institutions. People value politeness, a firm handshake, and looking someone in the eye. Court days in Providence are serious affairs, but they are also imbued with this local ethos. There's an expectation of civility, an unwritten rule that when you step into a courtroom, you acknowledge the gravity of the setting. People dress appropriately, not necessarily in their finest, but in attire that shows respect for the process. They speak when spoken to, they listen, and they understand that the judge's word is, within that courtroom, the law. This isn't just about legal statutes. It's about a fundamental understanding of order and mutual respect that underpins the community. And at the heart of this civic understanding sits Judge Caprio. He isn't just a judge. He's practically a local legend, a figure who embodies the very spirit of Providence. Known globally for his compassionate rulings, particularly in traffic violations and minor infractions, his courtroom has become an unexpected stage for lessons in responsibility and empathy. His videos, watched by millions, showcase a man who balances the letter of the law with a deep understanding of human frailties. Yet, beneath that well-documented compassion lies a firm hand, a bedrock of principle that demands respect for the court and for the process. He uses his platform not just to adjudicate, but to educate, to guide, and sometimes to gently correct. This is the world J.D. Vance had walked into, seemingly oblivious to its nuances. Vance, from what little was known of him by local whispers and the occasional national news bite, carried himself with an air of self-importance, a subtle entitlement that often rubbed people the wrong way. He wasn't from Providence, and perhaps that was part of the problem. He hadn't grown up with the quiet understanding of how things worked here. The unwritten rules of engagement, the deep-seated respect for figures like Judge Caprio. He seemed to view the court, and perhaps the city itself, as a temporary inconvenience, a hurdle to be cleared with minimal effort and maximum disdain. There was a subtle tension in the courtroom that day, a familiar undercurrent whenever an outsider, particularly one with a perceived sense of superiority, entered the local system. It was a tension born from experience, from observing countless individuals who believed their status or their perceived importance exempted them from the common courtesies and rules that bound everyone else. Vance's behavior wasn't just rude. It was an affront to the collective sense of order and dignity that Providence held dear. The local observers in the gallery, the court staff, even the hum of the old building itself seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between this entitled outsider and the quiet, immovable force that was Judge Caprio. The stage was set, not just for a legal proceeding, but for a clash of cultures, a confrontation between arrogance and the deeply ingrained values of a community. Vance's dismissive attitude in Judge Caprio's courtroom was far from an isolated incident. Indeed, a deeper dive into his past revealed a troubling pattern, a consistent thread of disregard for rules, for decorum, and for the authority of others. It was as if he operated under a personal exemption clause, believing that the standards applied to everyone else simply didn't pertain to him. The narrator had heard stories, witnessed glimpses, and pieced together a mosaic of behaviors that painted a clear picture of ingrained entitlement. There was the widely circulated anecdote from a few years prior, during a particularly contentious town hall meeting in a neighboring community. Vance, then attempting to make inroads with local politicians, had arrived nearly an hour late, disrupting the proceedings with his grand entrance. Instead of offering a humble apology, he had simply sauntered to the front, cutting off a speaker mid-sentence and demanding the floor. When gently reminded of the established protocol, he had scoffed, muttering audibly about the inefficiency of small-town bureaucracy. He'd then proceeded to dominate the discussion, dismissing the concerns of several local residents as petty and short-sighted, all while checking his watch repeatedly, as if their legitimate grievances were merely an obstacle to his more important schedule. Another instance, more casual but equally telling, involved a local charity gala. Vance, a guest of honor, had been observed openly talking on his phone during a poignant speech by a community leader. When a discreet usher attempted to signal him, he had waved them off dismissively, continuing his conversation with an air of profound self-importance. Later, during the silent auction, he had reportedly engaged in a heated argument with a volunteer over the bidding process, insisting that his donation entitled him to special privileges, despite the clear rules laid out for all attendees. He seemed genuinely perplexed when the volunteer stood firm, unable to comprehend why he, J.D. Vance, should be subjected to the same rules as everyone else. His reputation for what some called selective engagement was also well known. Colleagues and associates often spoke of his tendency to ignore emails and calls from those he deemed less important, only to respond with lightning speed to requests from individuals of higher social or political standing. It wasn't just a matter of being busy. It was a deliberate hierarchy of responsiveness, a clear indication of who he believed deserved his attention and who did not. This perceived superiority often manifested in subtle yet deeply irritating ways. A local journalist once recounted trying to secure an interview with Vance, only to be met with repeated postponements and last-minute cancellations, often with no explanation. When the interview finally happened, Vance spent a significant portion of it looking past the reporter, seemingly scanning the room for someone more significant. Perhaps the most revealing incident, one that resonated with his behavior in Judge Caprio's court, occurred during a road trip through a different state. Vance had been pulled over for a minor traffic offense, speeding in a clearly marked school zone. Instead of accepting the ticket and moving on, he had launched into an aggressive tirade against the officer, questioning their authority, their intelligence, and even their right to pull him over. He had demanded to speak to a supervisor, threatened legal action, and declared that he was a public figure who shouldn't be subjected to such petty harassment. He was convinced that his status, whatever it might be, should grant him immunity from traffic laws, just as he believed it should grant him immunity from courtroom etiquette. These were not isolated lapses in judgment. They were consistent, recurring patterns. Vance's behavior in Judge Caprio's courtroom, therefore, was not a sudden outburst or a momentary lapse. It was the predictable culmination of years of operating under the delusion that he was exempt from the everyday rules and expectations that governed ordinary citizens. He had cultivated a pattern of treating others, especially those in positions of authority he didn't immediately respect or recognize as superior, with a casual disdain, an almost inherent sense of superiority. The audience, now privy to this deeper understanding of Vance's character, could see that his actions in court were not merely an isolated incident of rudeness. They were a vivid reflection of a deeply ingrained character flaw, a long-standing pattern of disrespect that had finally met its match in the quiet, unyielding authority of Judge Caprio. The stage was set, not just for a legal proceeding, but for a fundamental clash between arrogance and the deeply ingrained values of a community, with the judge poised to deliver a lesson that had been a long time coming. Judge Caprio, despite his outwardly calm demeanor, had reached a critical juncture with Vance's persistent defiance. The initial surprise had quickly given way to a quiet, steely resolve. A simple fine, a stern lecture, or even a contempt charge, he reasoned, would likely be perceived by Vance as little more than a temporary inconvenience. Another minor hurdle to be navigated before returning to his self-appointed pedestal. The judge understood that to truly impart a lesson, one that would resonate beyond the confines of the courtroom, and perhaps even penetrate Vance's thick layer of self-importance, he needed a different approach. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about upholding the sanctity of the court and, more broadly, the principle of respect for rules and authority. As Vance stood there, still radiating an aura of impatient arrogance, arms crossed, a sneer playing on his lips, Judge Caprio's mind began to work with methodical precision. He didn't erupt in anger. Such an emotional display would only validate Vance's perceived superiority, confirming his belief that he could provoke and control the reactions of others. Instead, the judge's gaze, though unwavering, seemed to look past Vance, delving into the deeper implications of such behavior for the justice system itself. He knew that the eyes of the community, and indeed, a global audience through his widely broadcasted courtroom, were upon him. This was a moment that demanded not just a ruling, but a carefully crafted response, a piece of judicial theater designed to educate and, if necessary, humble. While Vance tapped his foot impatiently, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of his situation, Judge Caprio maintained his composed exterior. The contrast was stark. Vance's outward insolence against the judge's quiet, internal resolve. It was a battle of wills, and one that Judge Caprio was determined to win, not through brute force, but through strategic intellect. He subtly glanced at his clerk, a silent, almost imperceptible signal. The clerk, accustomed to the judge's nuanced communication, understood immediately. A moment later, a discreet folder was placed before him, containing not just Vance's immediate case details, but perhaps a summary of his past interactions within the legal system, or even publicly reported incidents that spoke to his character. The judge's gaze swept over the documents, not lingering on any particular detail, but absorbing the overall pattern. He wasn't just reacting to the immediate disrespect. He was contextualizing it within Vance's broader persona. He considered legal precedents, not just for contempt, but for creative sentencing, for consequences that went beyond the typical punitive measures. He wasn't looking to merely punish. He was looking to teach, to instill a sense of accountability that Vance had clearly managed to avoid for too long. His mind analyzed potential outcomes, weighing the impact of various sentences, not just on Vance, but on the public perception of justice. A subtle tightening of his jaw, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, was the only outward sign of the growing determination within Judge Caprio. He realized that upholding the respect of the court was paramount, not just for his personal authority, but for the fundamental integrity of the entire justice system. If individuals like Vance could simply disregard court rules, interrupt judges, and treat legal proceedings with contempt, then the very foundation of law and order would begin to erode. He was determined to make an example, not out of personal malice or vindictiveness, but out of a profound commitment to principle, to the idea that everyone, regardless of their perceived status, must adhere to the rule of law. The lesson he was about to deliver would be firm, fair, and, most importantly, unforgettable. A stark reminder that even the most entitled among us are not above the rules. The courtroom, still tense and silent, awaited the judge's pronouncement, unaware of the carefully considered, deeply strategic response that was about to unfold. The air in the courtroom, already thick with anticipation, grew heavier as Judge Caprio finally broke his silence. He returned his gaze to Vance, whose defiance, though still present, seemed to waver slightly under the judge's unwavering stare. The court officer, a burly man with an air of quiet efficiency, stood a few feet away from Vance, a silent sentinel. Vance, still with a trace of his earlier arrogance, finally spoke, a hint of exasperation in his tone. "Look, Judge, can we just get on with it? I have places to be. Just give me the fine, whatever it is. I'll pay it." He made a dismissive gesture, as if pulling out his wallet would instantly resolve the entire situation. Judge Caprio's voice, when it came, was calm, measured, yet imbued with an unmistakable authority that cut through Vance's flippancy. "Mr. Vance," he began, "you seem to labor under the misapprehension that this courtroom operates as a drive-through window for your convenience. Your repeated disrespect, your blatant disregard for the rules, and your refusal to follow simple instructions have not gone unnoticed, nor will they go unaddressed." He paused, letting his words hang in the silence. "You believe a simple fine will suffice? A mere monetary transaction to absolve you of your behavior? I assure you, Mr. Vance, that will not be the case today." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Vance's face. He had clearly expected a standard reprimand, perhaps an inflated fine, but nothing more. He opened his mouth to protest, but Judge Caprio raised a hand, a gesture that immediately commanded silence. "This court is a place of respect, order, and justice," the judge continued, his voice rising slightly, "and it will be treated as such. Your actions have not only shown contempt for this bench, but for the very institutions that uphold our society. And for that, Mr. Vance, there will be consequences that extend far beyond your wallet." Then came the stunner. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Therefore, in light of your persistent disrespect for public institutions, your contempt for this court, and your demonstrated need for a lesson in humility and civic responsibility, I am not merely fining you. I am ordering you to perform 100 hours of community service." Vance's jaw dropped, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked like a man who had just been told his expensive car had been repossessed for a parking ticket. The murmurs that had begun to rise in the gallery abruptly ceased, replaced by a collective gasp. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "And not just any community service, Mr. Vance," he clarified, his voice now carrying an undeniable weight. "Your service will be directly related to the very institutions you have shown such disdain for. You will report to the City Hall building, starting tomorrow morning, and you will spend your hours cleaning and maintaining the public facilities there. This includes, but is not limited to, scrubbing floors, emptying trash receptacles, and assisting the janitorial staff. Furthermore, for a portion of your service, you will be required to sit in the back of this very courtroom, observing other court sessions, not as a participant, but as a silent witness to the proper decorum and respect due to the judicial process." The arrogance completely drained from Vance's face, replaced by a mixture of shock, humiliation, and a dawning sense of fear. He spluttered, But Judge, I'm a public figure. This is outrageous. I can't be seen scrubbing toilets." His voice, usually so confident, cracked with indignity. Judge Caprio's response was swift and unyielding. "Mr. Vance, your public figure status, as you call it, does not exempt you from accountability. In fact, it makes your behavior all the more egregious. And let me be perfectly clear. Any further disruption, any attempt to shirk your duties, or any display of disrespect during your community service will result in a more severe penalty, including potential jail time for contempt. Do you understand?" Vance, now utterly defeated, could only nod, his face pale. The court officer, who had been observing the exchange with a stoic expression, stepped forward. "Mr. Vance, if you'll come with me, I'll provide you with the necessary paperwork and instructions for your community service." As the officer gently but firmly guided a visibly stunned Vance towards the exit, a profound silence settled over the courtroom. Then, as Vance was led out, a quiet murmur of agreement and satisfaction rippled through the observers. In the back row, a few older folks, pillars of the Providence community, exchanged knowing glances and offered small, almost imperceptible nods of approval. They had witnessed true justice, administered not with anger or vengeance, but with a firm hand and a clear purpose. Judge Caprio had delivered a lesson that went beyond the letter of the law, a lesson in humility and respect that Vance, for all his perceived importance, would be forced to learn the hard way. The impact on J.D. Vance was immediate and profound. The story of his public humiliation, his forced community service, scrubbing toilets, and observing court proceedings spread like wildfire through the local media and eventually across the internet. His carefully cultivated public image, built on a foundation of perceived intellectual superiority and political ambition, fractured under the weight of Judge Caprio's unconventional sentence. He was no longer just J.D. Vance, the well-known figure. He was J.D. Vance, the guy who had to clean public restrooms because he couldn't show basic respect in court. The visibility of his community service was a constant, stark reminder of his arrogance, a public penance that forced him to confront his own entitled behavior in the most humbling way imaginable. Each scrub of a toilet, each sweep of a public floor, each silent hour spent observing others' legal travails, chipped away at his self-importance. He was forced to interact with people he would normally dismiss, to see the world from a perspective he had long considered beneath him. This was not merely punishment. It was a forced re-education in humility. For the narrator, observing this unfolding drama, there was a deep sense of vindication. It wasn't about schadenfreude, but a reaffirmation of a core belief that true authority, when wielded with wisdom and integrity, could indeed bring about meaningful change. Judge Caprio's response transcended the typical legal framework, reaching into the realm of moral education. It underscored the vital importance of respect, not just for the law, but for the institutions and individuals who uphold it. The narrator felt a renewed faith in the idea that even in a world increasingly characterized by self-interest and a disregard for norms, there were still those who believed in and enforced the fundamental principles of civility and accountability. This wasn't just a legal case. It was a parable for modern times. The incident served as a potent reminder that no one, regardless of their status, wealth, or perceived influence, is truly above the rules. The dignity of the court, and by extension, the dignity of the entire justice system, rests on the premise that all are equal before the law. Judge Caprio's decision was not solely about punishing Vance. It was about restoring that dignity, about reaffirming the sanctity of legal proceedings, and about teaching a valuable, if uncomfortable, lesson that reverberated far beyond Vance himself. It was a testament to the idea that true power doesn't lie in arrogance or bluster, but in the quiet, firm upholding of principles, in the unwavering commitment to justice and respect. The lesson Vance was forced to learn was one of fundamental human decency. Treating others, especially those in positions of authority, with respect is not optional. It is foundational to a functioning society. This seemingly harsh, yet ultimately effective sentence forced Vance into a period of profound introspection. He might not have liked it, but he was undeniably forced to learn. The public scrutiny, the physical labor, the quiet observation, all contributed to a gradual, grudging realization of the impact of his own behavior. It was a fresh start, not one he chose, but one imposed by a judge who saw beyond the immediate infraction to the deeper character flaw. Such moments, though deeply uncomfortable, often serve as catalysts for growth. Vance, stripped of his usual defenses and forced into a position of vulnerability, was given an undeniable opportunity to reflect and perhaps to change. The video concludes with the narrator reflecting on the surprising effectiveness of Judge Caprio's approach. It was a reminder that sometimes the most surprising and unconventional responses are indeed the most effective. Instead of escalating the conflict with anger, Judge Caprio chose a path of calculated consequence, transforming a moment of defiance into a public lesson in humility. His actions underscored that true power lies not in asserting dominance through force, but in the quiet, firm upholding of principles, in a wisdom that understands that the most profound lessons are often learned outside the traditional confines of punishment. The image of the powerful humbled by the steadfastness of justice left an indelible mark, a testament to the enduring power of respect and accountability in the courtroom and, by extension, in society as a whole.